The only person that we haven't heard from since God has spoken is Job. Job had a lot to say in the book of Job, didn't he, as he contemplated his suffering and the struggle that he was experiencing. But now God has spoken, and in the middle of God's monologue, Job is remarkably silent, doesn't have much to say. So we get to the end, and finally Job has a little bit something to say. We also haven't heard from the narrator since the first two chapters. The narrator, whoever wrote the book, whoever recorded this, kind of set the story up for us and then just laid out the conversation that took place. And we haven't heard from this person either. So a quick review of the book's plot. Some of you have been gone for a few weeks and have kind of missed out on where this has come from and where it's going to. Job, in quick summary, was a wealthy individual who was very godly. History shows us that Job was a somewhat well-known figure who had more wealth than most around him. The narrator somehow knows or at least describes the situation that unfolds in heaven, and that's a little confusing to us, because how does whoever wrote the book know what took place in heaven? Did God reveal it to him, or is this a rhetorical device to explain how some of this takes place? We're not sure. But indicates that somewhere in the heavenly realms a conversation is taking place between God and his helpers. One of them that's referred to in the book of Job is the Satan. We had a little discussion about whether this was really Satan or not, and we can leave that discussion alone, but there's some difficulty in understanding it exactly that way. But nonetheless, a conversation between God and one of his helpers, and the challenge is put out that Job is only faithful because God is rewarding him and blessing him. And God blesses, or at least allows, a testing to take place. The testing, in short, is one in which Job loses everything. Family, material possessions, and when he still doesn't then reject God, he loses his physical health. And of course, any of you who have struggled with an illness or an injury or been in great pain know that in moments of very great pain, you would do just about anything to be relieved of what is ailing you. And Job is being pressed to consider his relationship with God. Now, Job in all of this does not turn his back on God, but he certainly makes some questionable accusations. And his friends, in some ways, are arguing with him. And that really is the bulk of the book of Job as this plays out. His friends saying, Job, we believe in the retribution principle. In other words, Job, when you are righteous, God blesses you. That's how it works. And Job, when you are sinful, then you experience the curse of God. That's how it works. So Job, we've watched. You experienced blessing for quite some time. No doubt you walked in righteousness. But Job, right now you are obviously experiencing curse. So the only conclusion we can make, Job, is you have sinned egregiously. What have you done? We don't know, but you must have done something awful. And Job argues back, no. He said, go ahead, search my life. Point out to me what it is that you think that I have done that is so much worse than those around me. And I will confess, but you won't find anything because there is nothing. Job looks at his friends and says, listen, we all admit that we're sinful beings. All of us deserve curse at some level. So if you guys are blessed and I am cursed, you have to point out to me how I am so much more evil than the three of you. Well, that raises the ire of his friends, and they only go back to the main point. They argue the same point over and over and over again. They say nothing new. They just say it differently. They say it with more animation. Maybe they pound their fists a little more. And here's Job suffering. Unmitigated disaster is Job's life at this point. And his friends look right at him and point an accusing finger at him and saying, Job, you've done something horrible. Job, you're doing something wrong. Confess it. Job can't agree with those conclusions. Job simply says this, listen, I'm not guilty of anything that deserves this kind of punishment. Therefore, if this kind of punishment is happening, I have to conclude certain things about God. God, though he is supposedly just and fair and good and all these things, is obviously also, though he's in complete control, Job doesn't question that, God must also be somewhat arbitrary. He doesn't necessarily look for, this principle of retribution that that God isn't seeing something the way I see it, and so he just arbitrarily must dump curse on some people, arbitrarily dumps blessing on. That's why my neighbor Joe, who's such a horrible person, says Job, is getting blessed, while I, the righteous, innocent one, am being cursed. Well, at the end of a rather long conversation where neither sides can agree, Elihu steps in, a fourth friend, and says, no, you guys, you're not understanding it. You're both wrong. What you both aren't realizing is that you have a limited understanding. Job, just because you're experiencing suffering doesn't mean that God is cursing you specifically. In fact, Elihu suggests to Job that Job thinks he's much more important than he actually is. Elihu suggests to Job that God's plan is about like this. Job's vision of that plan is about like this, and it's awfully arrogant of Job to think that God is so concerned about Job in this grand scheme of things that he thinks God is specifically picking on Job for suffering. It could just be that Job is a byproduct of a much bigger plan he doesn't understand. Job's three friends don't have much to say to that. Neither does Job. And finally, last week, we heard from God. And God takes what Elihu says and draws it out quite a bit further. And if you remember last week, we spent a good time just reading the text. Sometimes all the time, but some places you read the text and you go, what else are you going to say? And God asks these unanswerable questions. Where were you when I created the earth? I don't remember seeing you anywhere. Can you control Behemoth, which we thought maybe was the hippopotamus? I mean, seriously, you come face to face with a hippopotamus. You're going to tell it what to do? Who are you exactly? Why is it that you accuse me of being so petty as that I would be completely arbitrary when you don't know a fraction of what I do? And we reach the end. And Job, in brokenness, says, I was wrong. I made unfair accusations. I thought much, much, much too highly of myself. There's so much in those first 6 verses. I really struggled this week with how to preach this, because there could be 3 or 4 sermons that grow to the first 6 verses. Here's some ideas that went through my head. The brokenness of Job. What does it mean when you come face to face with the reality of who God is and the reality of how petty and evil you are as a human being, and it's time to come to confession? Job actually says, therefore I despise myself. It's not to say that Job hates himself. That would be bad psychology, of course. It would be bad theology too. But in retrospect, Job is feeling shame for the attitude he had toward God. There's a great sermon wrapped up in here about the humility that it would require for Job's friends who have accused Job so harshly and so adamantly and so arrogantly and so self-assuredly that they now have to go to Job. And in order to be forgiven by God, God says, you need to go to Job and Job will pray on your behalf. I'll accept his prayer. So these friends who have been in Job's face, who have cut him down, who have humiliated him and challenged him and accused him wrongly, now have to go to Job and say, sorry, Job, would you please ask God to forgive us? Wow, what a sermon that would be. Imagine the sermon that would be preached about Job, who you'll notice in the text is still suffering. He hasn't gained anything back. He has no wealth. He has no family. His health has not been returned to him. And God is saying, Job, your friends are going to come ask you forgiveness. I want you to offer it to them. Job, who has been suffering and whose friends have made it 1,000 times worse by pointing their fingers in his face, is now being told to forgive those friends and go to the next level. Job's statement could have been a whole sermon in verse 5. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. There's a whole sermon about the massive difference between knowing about God and knowing God in a personal, relational way. I couldn't pick, so I put them all on the shelf and said, well, there's a good 4-sermon series sometime. Let's do something different. I thought it important today to review and clarify some conclusions that we had learned about suffering in our relationship with God from the book of Job. What we'll look at this morning is 5 conclusions that we have drawn throughout this study. The problem with wording a conclusion too simplistically is, unless you're very clear, you can take a true statement and mean something completely untrue by it. So I thought, as a way of reviewing, but also a way of digging in a little deeper, let's look at 5 true statements and then clarify them so we understand just exactly what the book of Job reveals to us. Okay, so here are the conclusions, 5 conclusions to clarify as a way of summarizing the book of Job, as a way of moving forward from here, and maybe down the road into digging into the first 6 verses of Job chapter 42 in more depth. Statement conclusion number 1, we suffer because we deserve it. On several levels, that is a completely true statement. This has, in fact, been the primary argument of Job's friends. Now, the way Job's friends understood it is completely false. On the other side of the coin, if we look at it differently, it's completely true. Let's understand that. Job's friends are on the false side of this coin. Righteousness, it's the retribution principle. Righteousness equals blessing, sin equals curse. 1-to-1. When you do good, good things happen. When you do bad, bad things happen. That's their idea. That is false. We suffer because we deserve it is true on the level that sin has produced all suffering. We don't deserve anything in a big picture kind of way. We don't deserve anything but suffering because of our sinfulness. That was the curse that took place in the Garden of Eden that has carried on since the beginning of time. Romans chapter 5 talks about that curse quite a bit. Matthew chapter 20 is one of those parables that constantly brings me back to this idea that whatever I get in terms of blessing is well and above beyond what I deserve, because I don't deserve anything but suffering and punishment because of my sinfulness. Matthew chapter 20 is the parable of the vineyard, the owner and the workers. And he goes out in the morning and he says, will you work for me for a day? I'll give you a fair day's wage. And at 9 and at noon and 3 and at 5, he does the same thing. I'll give you a fair day's wage. Well, at the end of the day, he pays all of those workers exactly what he promised them, a fair day's wage. But to some, he actually gives a full day's wage even though they worked for an hour. And the ones that worked all day said, well, this isn't right. How come they worked an hour, we worked 12, and we get paid the same amount? And the owner of the vineyard says, well, wait a minute, didn't you get exactly what I promised you? If I decide to give others much more than that, what business is it of yours? And there's this sense here that says, listen, whatever you get in terms of blessing from God is well beyond what you deserve. If you look at the workers that went to the vineyard, they were standing around the marketplace at 6 o'clock in the morning with nothing to do. They deserved nothing. Someone came and got them, invited them, gave them work, and paid for that work through no doing of their own. And yet, at the end of the day, they were upset because they had only got what had been promised them, while others got quite a bit more than had been promised them. And so there's this idea that says, listen, it's a true statement. We suffer because we deserve it. Because of our sinfulness, we don't deserve anything but suffering, curse, death. That is the result of sin. Romans 3, the wages of sin is death. Since we're all sinners, we deserve death. So that's a true statement. On the level that Job's friends were speaking it is completely false. On the level, it is wrong because it eliminates the grace of God. I should say on that level, the level that Job's friends are talking about, where there's a one-to-one relationship, good, blessing, sin, curse, it is wrong because it completely eliminates the grace of God and how God relates to humanity by way of that grace. What does the grace of God look like within his relationship to humanity that takes this beyond suffering? Galatians chapter 3 and many other places that could be used as texts to support this idea. I've just chosen a couple. Before this faith came, we were held prisoners by the law, locked up until faith should be revealed. So the law was put in charge to lead us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. Now that faith has come, we are no longer under the supervision of the law. Galatians chapter 5, it is for freedom that Christ has set you free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Mark my words, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law. You who are trying to be justified by law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. But by faith we eagerly await through the Spirit the righteousness for which we hope. Now that's a lot of context and a lot of cultural stuff happening in those passages, and yet this overriding idea is that by the grace of God, we have been set free. By the grace of God, we do not receive that which we deserve. By the grace of God, we deserve to suffer, but an avenue has been created through which we can experience blessing upon blessing. And in that blessing, there is great, great freedom. Romans chapter 5 speaks of this. But the gift is not like the trespass. For if the many died by the trespass of the one man, how much more did God's grace and the gift that came by the grace of one man, Jesus Christ, overflow to many? Again, the gift of God is not like the result of one man's sin. The judgment followed one sin and brought condemnation, but the gift followed many trespasses and brought justification. By grace through faith, there is a freedom. So in this sense then, when we suffer, we cannot say it is because God is punishing us for our sin specifically. Yes, there is a relationship between sin and suffering. We are sinful, therefore there is suffering. But there is not a one-to-one relationship between the evil things that we do or the mistakes that we make and the immediate and obvious punishment that follows. This plays out very naturally. Some of us just returned from Haiti a few months ago. And if you spend any time in Haiti, you have to wonder, how did a whole nation become this destitute? How did they become so blind and so destitute and so impoverished and so lost? And what will everybody tell you? In Christian circles, we immediately point to a one-to-one relationship between suffering and sin. Is there a relationship? Yes. Do we know the mind of God that we can point out this one-to-one relationship? I think it would be arrogant of us to say so. Did the Haitians make some kind of deal with the devil in history and so on and so forth? Yes, they did. Historically accurate. Do we absolutely know that because of that, God punished them in this kind of poverty way? Maybe. Do we know? Well, where were you when God created the earth? Can you confront the hippopotamus and have him do what you say? I think we ought to be very careful when we start deciding exactly how God is punishing people for their sin. For we now know through Job that sin and suffering do not necessarily work in a one-to-one relationship. The list could go on, right? When Katrina happened, how many Bible thumpers did you hear saying, well, yeah, because of New Orleans' sinfulness, God has finally punished them? How many churches do we see picketing at the funerals of dead military men? Because, well, really only one church. But blaming these deaths on America's position on homosexuality. We suffer because we deserve it, yes. And no. Not in a one-to-one way. I better pick it up or we're going to be here all day. Conclusion number 2. Suffering is God's will. Well, yes, but no. Yes, logically it is. If it happened, either God is out of control and can't stop it, or God is in control and he allowed it to happen. So on one level, suffering was within God's will. He allowed something to happen. And so we come up with these little ways to justify our experience because we don't really understand how God works. We don't really get exactly on what level this is true. And so we come up with these cute little ways of talking about his permissive will versus sovereign will. God has two kinds of will, and stuff that he allows to happen and stuff. And it's all a little dicey because really we're just doing what Job did and trying to justify our experience. James chapter 1 says, listen, when you suffer, rejoice in it, because suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance produces character, and character, hope. Romans chapter 5 says something similar. Romans 5 says, and hope does not disappoint us. Literature says injury. I read this week as a quote. Every injury is a gift. Every gift is an injury. I had a little troubles with that, because I'm pretty sure the scriptures tell me that every good and perfect gift is from the Father, and right now I can't raise my arm because my shoulder hurts, and I'm not sure what kind of gift that is. It See, it suggests to us that the only way God can teach us and show us is by hurting us. If God wants to show you something and God wants to give you a good thing that's going to have eternal value, he must hurt you. He must punish you. And that contravenes everything that we know to be true of the marvelous love of Jesus as demonstrated on the cross. Again, Romans chapter 5. God demonstrates his own love toward us in this: while we were yet sinners, while we were deserving of suffering, God poured out his love on us in giving us his son Jesus. So where do we get this notion that if we're suffering, the only way that God can teach us is by making us hurt? So to understand the statement, suffering is God's will, we have to really differentiate between result and reason. And I think this is where we've made a mistake. In a general way, we've already said suffering happens because of sin. That is the reason there is suffering, because of sin, in a general way. In his grace, God uses that suffering to shape us for good. That is grace. And that is the result of God's grace amidst suffering. But it could well also then be said that it is wrong to say that the purpose of suffering, that God purposefully hurts us to teach us, as a reason for our suffering. There's a difference between result and reason. Let me say it this way. I remember being younger, before we were married, us young men discussing dating and marriage and girls and what was appropriate. We were Christian men, what was appropriate, what was inappropriate in our dating relationships, and so on and so forth. And then later on, we got married, and then we had some of those same conversations about dating and what we had and hadn't been involved in and how that played out in our marriage and so on. I remember one of my friends who wasn't particularly concerned with the moral lines when it came to dating, making a statement like this, and I know I'm saying it in a leading way, and I know he didn't probably mean it this way, but nonetheless his words were this: I'm glad I did all of that sinful stuff because it helps me help other people who are in the same place. And I went, what? That sounds preposterous. It's like saying, and I'm going to really switch it around, it's very much like saying, God made me sin so that later on I could be used to help people who struggle with the same sins. To which all of us would go, no, there's a difference between reason and result. More appropriately, you sinned. And God in his grace took even your sin and used it for his glory by turning it into something good that you can help others with by his grace. That's a significant difference between reason for your sin and result of your sin. And the difference between reason and result is the grace of God. In much the same way, to say that suffering is God's will, that God likes and enjoys seeing people suffer, is not true. Suffering happens as a result of sin. God, in his grace and mercy, uses that suffering for great good. But the opposite is also not true. Suffering is all the fault of Satan. Well, yes, on some level, Satan plays a role in suffering. But the scriptures tell us that there's sin in our lives is only because of one person. Me. Well, not me, but all of us for our own sin. I'm not responsible for your sin, just to be clear. We portray Satan as God's enemy. But more realistically, he's not God's enemy, he's our enemy. Because he's completely under God's control. I mean, if an adult sees a 3-year-old child as their enemy, that adult has some problems. Because, yeah, that 3-year-old can present some challenges, but we just kind of go, yeah, I got that taken care of. You can't dictate my life. And in the same way, except in a far greater way, but at the same kind of idea, Satan isn't really God's enemy. God is in complete control over Satan. Satan is evidence that there's disorder, but he is not responsible for suffering. He just has a role to play. The suffering you experience is a result of sin, some of which is your own. Number 4, suffering, there's 5 just in case you're getting impatient. Suffering always has an identifiable reason. You ever been suffering, struggling, and a good friend, a mentor maybe, a wise person has said, hey, listen, who knows what God has preparing you for through this suffering? Have you heard something like that? It's kind of true. But more accurately worded, who knows how God will use this pain for good in the future? Again, we get to this reason versus result, and we conclude that God is like with Joseph, allowing the suffering to happen to produce what will be good in the future. Well, perhaps, but only perhaps, to suggest that we know exactly what God is thinking and exactly what God is doing, and to know exactly what role our suffering is playing into the grand scheme of things is nothing but arrogance. Arrogance for which Job was chastised for by God. To suggest that you know exactly how your suffering is going to play into the greater scheme is arrogance. Sometimes you suffer and you simply do not know what the outcome or purpose or reason or result will be. And so I use some caution and I choose my words carefully, and I encourage others to do so as well. You won't hear me stand up here and tell you, God gave me a message and I'm going to share it with you. Same hesitance I have, and you've had this experience, I've had it many times. I had a dream last night, or God told me to tell you. And I say thank you. That's good to hear. And then I turn it over to God and say, well, God, if that's real, can you also tell me? And sometimes if I'm really in a sarcastic mood and someone tells me that God told them to tell me, and say, well, next time you talk to God, would you let him know to give me a call as well? That's not the right thing to say. But perhaps we ought to exercise caution, just because God is a little bigger than our understanding. Maybe we ought to exercise caution in our claims. This Friday on July 4th, there's going to be a parade in town. And this is an illustration that helps me understand at least why it is that we exercise caution. Suppose that on July 4th in the morning, you are kidnapped by a large man. And this large man ties you up, knocks you out, throws you in the trunk of his car, and slams the lid shut. And as he's racing to leave Pembina, he is not aware that this is July 4th and there's a parade. And so he has to park at a stop sign and wait for the parade to pass through before you can make his escape. You, while the parade is just starting, come too. And as best you can, you look out the keyhole of the trunk. And you see this parade, and you see a little blip at a time. How great an idea do you have of what's happening? You just see a tiny little blip at a time. A little kid on a tricycle, and a clown goes by, and then a tractor, and you only see a part of the tractor because the keyhole is so small. You have no idea how long the parade is. You have no idea what town you're in. You have no idea how many people are there. You have no concept of the big picture. You just see little blips. I wonder if we should be cautious just exactly how assertively we talk about what God is doing and how he's going to do it and what his purposes and reasons are. Boldness, absolutely. Boldness to say, I see God working and it's fun to be a part of, and I love to see that this was the result this week and this was the result. Do I know exactly how this is all going to fit together? Do I know exactly how long it's going to take? No, I have no idea. I am in it for today, walking with God as he shows us what he's doing. The same is true for suffering. To identify the reason, the purpose, and try to have an understanding is doing exactly what Job is, when sometimes we have to say, this fits into God's plan. It's not that he wants me to suffer. It's not that he's enjoying me falling apart. I think this fits into the plan somehow. I just don't know how. And maybe it's not about me. Maybe it's about somebody else. Lastly, suffering is God exercising unbridled dominion over us. When I wrote it the first time, I said, suffering is God exercising his uncaring and arbitrary power over us, but that wasn't a true statement. In some ways, it's true that suffering is God exercising his unbridled dominion over us. God allowing us to suffer when he could stop it is God exercising dominion. That was one of Job's conclusions, that God was doing it in an arbitrary and angry way. Much like I did when I was younger. I have a confession to make. This week, it just came to my mind again, because have you noticed that we nearly passed through spring. We're kind of just in the mud of spring. We had passed through the heaviest of the mosquito season, maybe? Okay, maybe not. Maybe the mosquito season isn't quite past yet, but what we introduced this week was the black fly season. You notice that? These little tiny black flies that are, mosquitoes are annoying because they just hover over you and then they go in for the kill when you don't expect it. But these flies, they don't quit. They'll land on that same spot on your leg with your, where you can't quite reach, and you go like this, then bite, and they just keep going back to that same spot, and it drives you insane. So when I was younger and more arbitrary, I would catch those flies and keep them alive. So I could, sometimes you could get them in your hands like this, and then I'd very carefully, I was probably 12 or 13, very carefully hold them by the legs and pluck their wings off. I didn't want to kill them. I wanted them to suffer a little. I'd pluck the wings off these flies, and then I'd put them on the hood of the pickup